Last year, we saw the release of the Odin 2, which set a new standard in the retro handheld space with its inclusion of the cutting-edge Qualcomm Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. Not content to rest on their laurels, AYN returns with a new handheld that takes the power of the Odin 2 and miniaturizes it for their new Odin 2 Mini, which is heavily inspired by the PlayStation Vita and in many ways feels like the successor to the Vita that we never received. The Odin 2 Mini still packs the same Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, but promises to set another standard not yet seen in the handheld space, with a display capable of reaching 1100 nits of brightness using a mini LED panel. For those concerned with size, this smaller form factor may just be what the Dr. Mario ordered. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we explore AYN's follow-up to their extremely popular Odin 2 handheld and find out if Mini can still be mighty. Let's first jump into these specs, and for those with an Odin 2, there will be some similarities here. But first, let's start out with the biggest difference here, which is going to be the 5-inch mini LED touchscreen display at a resolution of 1920 by 1080 and reaches 1100 nits of brightness with a 1,000,000:1 contrast ratio. Similar to the Odin 2, the Mini is powered by Qualcomm's Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, which is an 8-core CPU with a Cortex X3 Prime core that has clock speeds up to 3.2 GHz, and features Adreno 740 graphics. This time around, AYN has opted to ship the Odin 2 Mini in just 2 configurations, unlike the 3 that we saw with the original Odin 2. We have the base model with 8GB of RAM and 128GB of storage, and then the Pro model with 12GB of RAM and 256GB of storage. Both configurations use LPDDR5X RAM and UFS 4.0 storage. The unit I have in hand is the 12GB Pro model. The Odin 2 Mini, like its big brother, includes Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 5.3. There is a USB 3.1 Type-C port for data, charging, and display out, as well as a micro HDMI for video out and a 3.5mm headset port. The Odin 2 Mini features a smaller 5000 mAh battery. It ships with Android 13 out of the box, and it is available directly from AYN's website for pre-order, with the pre-order period ending on June 21st, and units should start to ship after that date. The Odin 2 Mini starts at $339 for the base model and $399 for the Pro model. There is an additional $10 discount during the pre-order campaign. The unit here was provided to me by AYN for the purpose of this video, and as I always require, they did not review this video prior to publishing. So it's time to unbox, and this is slightly familiar, especially to anyone that owns the Odin 2, which has a similar aesthetic. I love the minimalistic design with the outline of the Odin 2 Mini that reflects in the light. It just looks really classy, and there's no doubt about what is inside the box here. Looking around, and there's not much to make note of, but on the top of the package we do have the model and color marked here, and as I mentioned earlier, this time around AYN is shipping the Odin 2 Mini in just the base and Pro models. The unit I have here is the Black Pro. I'm gonna go ahead and gently peel back the AYN sticker that's keeping this sealed. We are now ready to undo this flap, which is magnetic and brings back memories of the Odin 2 unboxing for me. And just like before, we have an insert that has the AYN logo front side, but on the back details the specifications of the Mini, as well as the interface options available here. We've got a pretty thick foamy insert here. Seriously, this might be the thickest I've seen, and will definitely help keep the Mini nice and secure in its packaging. And then, of course, the Mini in black, which is peeking through its plastic baggie, but its reveal will have to wait for just a moment while I check out the rest of the contents. We have a USB-C to C cable, and this is a pretty nice cable, and I do like the AYN branding on both sides. But at this point, I have so many USB-C cables that I'm actually seriously considering trading some of these for a micro USB cable, since I'm actually ironically starting to need those more. Finally, we have the plastic insert which holds the Mini in place, with nothing else in the package included. It's now time for that reveal with some delicious baggy ASMR for your listening pleasure. And my first thought is, wow, that's a lot smaller than the Odin 2 and pretty impressive considering what this is packing in terms of power. And of course, this is as good of a time as ever to take a tour around the Mini and get intimate with the hardware. Starting at the top right, we have the stacked shoulder button and trigger configuration, and the R1 button here uses a clear plastic and very much resembles the PlayStation Vita. You know, that beloved handheld that Sony left behind many years ago. Unlike the Vita, these have an audible clickiness to them. They do press down nicely, and I like that they can be pressed down across the entirety of the button. I've been told by AYN that the only thing that is not final in my unit are the shoulder buttons, and so it will be interesting to see what changes here, as I find them to be pretty nice out of the box. Below the R1, we of course have the R2 trigger. These have a nice amount of travel, but obviously a little bit shorter than on the Odin 2, but they do press down smoothly and have just the right amount of force. I like that the R2 is wide so that your finger can rest across a good portion of it. Moving along now, we have the power button, indicator light, the volume up and down buttons, and then the micro HDMI out. And beside that, the micro SD slot, which is protected by the cover that swivels out, similar to the one on the Odin 2, but I do find this one much easier to get open. And finally, the left side shoulder button and trigger, which feel identical to the ones on the right side. As we move down the left side, there is nothing really to make note of here, and so at the bottom of the Mini, we have the 3.5mm headset port and the USB-C, which does support data, charging, and video out. Now moving towards the right side and similar to the left, we have nothing here to make note of, and so let's check out the back of the Mini. And immediately for me, the thing that stands out the most are the indents at each side, which again is very reminiscent of both Vita models, and then towards the center we have the very subtle AYN logo, and the intake vent for the active cooling that is built into this very small chassis for that Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. At the top you can see the dual exhaust vents, part of that active cooling solution. Let's now go front side and check out the analog stick first, which returns from the Odin 2 and has also been seen on the Retroid Pocket 2S and 4 Pro. And for me, these are a vast improvement over a lot of the typical handhelds that ship with those Switch style sticks. The range of movement alone is so much of an improvement, and I really do love these, and I hope that we continue to see them in more handhelds. Now, the D-pad below is also familiar territory for anyone with the Odin 2 or several of the Retroid handhelds, as they use this Vita-inspired D-pad. Now on the Mini, you can see that the D-pad is clear just like on a Vita, and this D-pad on the Mini might be the closest I have ever seen to copying that Vita, right down to its movement, pivot, travel, texture, you name it. I can already tell that this is going to be a lot of fun to use. Below the D-pad, we have more buttons that are clear, and these are your dedicated Android buttons for navigation. These do have a clickiness to them and are just slightly audible. Now below the navigation buttons, we have one of the built-in front-firing stereo speakers, and this is a very clever design as it mimics the Vita style, but uses this empty space from that design to incorporate speakers, which probably allows the Mini to have pretty solid speakers, and we will check all this out in the teardown in just a bit. And then, of course, in the center, we have the 5-inch mini LED panel. There is no branding of any kind here, and it does help keep things nice and clean. Now let's check out the face buttons, which are set up in the Xbox style ABXY. And these are going to be a bit different than the Vita ones, as the ones on the Mini have more travel and they are a bit noisier as well because of that extra movement in the shell. I do like the way they press down, and I actually welcome the additional travel on the buttons. You'll notice that these are clear as well, which AYN calls their crystal buttons, and again, they mimic the Vita style, and I do like the look of them as well as how they feel. One interesting thing to note is that if you look very closely at the face buttons, the letters are actually molded into the button, kind of like an Xbox Series controller, but they are not as smooth looking inside the crystal. The outlines are a bit rough looking. It's kind of hard to describe, but I think visually you can see the differences here between the two. Below the face buttons, we have the second analog stick, and you probably noticed by now, but these are asymmetrical, and so that is one of the big differences from a Vita, at least in terms of its overall layout. Moving down further, we have the equivalent of the start and select buttons, and finally, the second of the front-firing stereo speakers. So let's get this Mini unit turned on and check out how things are set up here, especially with Android. That Odin 2 logo is quite familiar, as is this setup process, which makes a return, and I've always liked the way AYN has this set up, which makes it feel less like an Android phone and more like something that was tailored for a handheld. So let's quickly pass through the initial setup, which will have you doing things like setting up Wi-Fi, language options, time zones, and then finally your choice of the launcher. There is the Odin launcher, which is very simple and basic, but for now, let's go with the standard Android, which is my preferred option and also allows you to use a launcher of your own choosing. I will say that this is going to be a quicker than usual tour through the software since I do want to focus on other areas. This is quite similar to what we have seen on the Odin 2, and we do have a very clean install of Android 13 here, which I always appreciate. Similar to the Odin 2, in the quick access we have things like performance profiles, fan adjustments, control style, and more. Additionally, when we launch a game or app, we have the Odin overlay, which can be accessed by swiping in from the right, and here we have access to really useful things like the gamepad mapping, frame counter, CPU and memory usage, and a few other things. I will demonstrate the gamepad mapping later on in this video if you are curious about that, but I do think it's time to move on and now measure up the Odin 2 Mini, and as always we have a few friends joining in on the fun. I think a lot of these devices will be very interesting to compare, but first let's go ahead and grab all the weights on these handhelds, starting out first with the Odin 2 Mini, which weighs in at 325 grams, or about 11.5 ounces. Let's now bring in the OLED Vita, also known as the Vita 1000, which is the original model, and this one weighs in at 281 grams, or just under 10 ounces. Next, we have the Vita 2000, which replaced the OLED model and is a bit lighter, coming in at 219 grams, or just under 8 ounces. It's really kind of insane just how light the Vita 2000 is. Now, one thing I think a lot of people will be interested in seeing are some comparisons to the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, which is quite pocketable and powerful. This comes in at 268 grams, or about 9.5 ounces, which makes it slightly lighter than a Vita 1000. Another one I think that will be very interesting to compare to is the Anbernic RG556, which I just featured in a pretty lengthy Switch emulation video. The RG556 comes in at 347 grams, or a little over 12 ounces, which does make this device heavier than the Odin 2 Mini. Of course, I can't forget about the Odin 2 Mini's big brother, the Odin 2, which is definitely a much larger and heavier device, coming in at 420 grams or just shy of 15 ounces. The amazing thing to remember here is that the Odin 2 Mini essentially packs almost all of the same features as the Odin 2, with one of those exceptions being the screen size. Let's now switch over to the Nintendo family with the compact Switch Lite, which weighs in at 275 grams or a little under 10 ounces. And then on the opposite end, we have the Switch OLED, which is definitely heftier at 421 grams or just shy of 15 ounces, which will make this the heaviest device featured here, and not all too surprising since it does have the largest display here. So we've got some numbers for the weights. Let's now compare the sizes here between all of these handhelds. First up, we're going to go with both Vita models, since I think it's almost a must to compare the Odin 2 Mini to the Vita, which it clearly draws a lot of inspiration from. It's truly amazing to see these three lined up, and it really drives home just how compact the Odin 2 Mini is. The Mini is only slightly wider than both models of the Vita, but it's not as tall as either model. Now, looking at the Vita 1000 compared to the Odin 2 Mini in terms of thickness, and it's kind of crazy to see how similar these are in thickness. I am pretty amazed that even with active cooling here, the Odin 2 Mini, while certainly thicker than some of the other handhelds, still manages to retain a fairly slim profile. Looking at the back of the Vita 1000 and the Odin 2 Mini, and again it's very obvious where a lot of the Mini's design language comes from, right down to the pads on the back. I do like that the Mini does not have a glossy texture like we do on the OLED Vita. Now, looking at the thickness of the Vita 2000 compared to the Mini, and the Vita 2000 is a remarkable piece of engineering, since somehow Sony managed to make it much thinner than the OLED model, and so compared to the Mini, it's definitely going to be thinner than it. And the same thing here with the back of the Vita 2000, which is slightly different than the 1000 model as it drops the glossy pads on the back, which is more in line with what the Mini is doing, but still has that glossy texture for the center of the back, most likely because it's a touch panel. Now, looking at the face buttons, there's no doubt that the ones on the Vita are pretty tiny. The ones on the Odin 2 Mini measure in at about 7mm with a thickness of about 19.5mm. Comparing those numbers to the Vita, which on the OLED, the face buttons come in at about 6.5mm with a thickness of about 18.5mm. The face buttons, unsurprisingly, are smaller, but what surprises me the most is that the thickness of the original Vita is only about 1mm thinner than the Odin 2 Mini, which is downright impressive because, again, the Odin 2 Mini does have active cooling packed into its chassis. Now, looking at the Vita 2000, and of course the face buttons are identical to the one on the OLED Vita, which are smaller than the ones on the Odin 2 Mini, coming in about 6.5mm or so. And as I suspected, the Vita 2000 is substantially thinner at just shy of 15mm, which makes it nearly 4.5mm thinner than the Odin 2 Mini. To be fair, the tech of the Vita 2000 still impresses me to this day. Here's another interesting comparison for the Vita models. The D-pads between the three are very similar, and the Odin 2 Mini is only slightly less wide than the ones found on the Vita by about 0.3mm. Finally, one last comparison is the crystal shoulder buttons, which again very much resemble the Vita in terms of their look, but I will say that I actually prefer the way the ones on the Odin 2 Mini press down. Okay, time to switch back to the Nintendo Switch handhelds, and I really love this shot as I think it best drives home just how impressively small the Odin 2 Mini is, especially when you see it under the Switch Lite, which is the smallest Switch handheld available. The other thing to keep in mind is that the Switch Lite's screen is only slightly larger than the one on the Odin 2 Mini, coming in at 5.5 inches versus the 5-inch display on the Mini. Now both of these Switch handhelds are fairly thin, and the Switch has always been impressively thin, especially considering it is an actively cooled handheld. Interestingly, when you look at the thickness side by side of the OLED Switch, you can see these similarities of the shoulder buttons, and so both will have that bump out because of the shoulder button at the bottom. Now at the thinnest point, the Switch OLED is only a little thicker than 14mm, which is quite a bit thinner than the Odin 2 Mini, which if you remember came in at about 19.5mm. Bringing back the Switch Lite, and again I just can't get over the compact size of the Odin 2 Mini. The Switch Lite does come in at about 14.3mm, and it's essentially the same as the entirety of the Switch lineup, and again much thinner than the Odin 2 Mini. Now from the top down perspective, we can see again how that shoulder button bump out at the bottom is quite similar between the Switch Lite and the Odin 2 Mini. Now measuring the face buttons on these Switch handhelds, these Switch buttons are definitely on the smaller side, with the face buttons on the Joy-Cons of the Switch OLED coming in at under 7mm. Okay, time to bring in the Anbernic RG556, which isn't really all that pocketable because of the grips that it has, which definitely adds to the comfort of the device. The RG556 has a slightly larger screen, coming in at 5.5 inches, and so because of all these things, the Odin 2 Mini is definitely more compact. Now looking at the thickness from this perspective, we can see that they appear to be very close, and the RG556 is also an actively cooled device like the Odin 2 Mini. They both also have those trigger bump outs at the bottom. The face buttons on the 556 measure at about 7.5mm and just slightly larger than the ones found on the Odin 2 Mini. Now measuring the actual thickness, and at its thinnest point, the RG556 is surprisingly thinner than it seems, coming in at a little over 15mm, which does make it thinner than the Odin 2 Mini, except that the 556 has those massive grips at each side. So let's bring in the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, which is quite similar in size to the Odin 2 Mini, at least in terms of width and height. And that's truly remarkable, but the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is a lot thinner than the Odin 2 Mini, but again shares similarities with many of the handhelds featured here, with that bump out at the bottom for the shoulder triggers. Now interestingly, when measuring the face buttons, they are essentially identical in size to the ones found on the Odin 2 Mini, and so yet another similar point for the size comparison between the two. Now measuring the actual thickness, the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, as I thought, is thinner at about 16mm, but I have to say that I am pretty impressed that despite it being thinner, we are talking about 3.5mm or so, and that really makes the Odin 2 Mini stand out, since it does have a substantially more powerful Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 packed in here. Finally, the last comparison, which has to be the older sibling with the original Odin 2. And in comparison to the Mini, this is a much larger device in all aspects. Now visually, in terms of thickness, these appear to be pretty similar, but at the bump outs for the triggers, the Odin 2 is going to be thicker. Now actually measuring the Odin 2's thickness, and it is very close with the Odin 2 coming in at 17mm, making the Odin 2 Mini 2.5mm thicker, which is impressive given how much more compact it is, in comparison needing only that additional 2.5mm. The Odin 2 does have a larger 6-inch display, but it's using an IPS panel instead of the Mini LED found on the Mini. And speaking of displays, it's time to talk about this display, which is new territory for the retro handheld space. AYN opted to use a Mini LED panel, which brings both benefits and some nuances that come with the technology. Now, I'm familiar with this over in the world of Apple hardware, as it's been used in both iPads and MacBooks, and so I'm acquainted with some of the inherent weaknesses of the Mini LED technology, specifically the vignetting. I spent a lot of time here adjusting my camera settings to truly best capture what I see here in person. The screen gets very bright, and so I had to make sure that my camera was not going to wash out the vivid colors that I'm seeing here. As such, I will have various changes in camera settings and lighting throughout to show a decent representation of what I'm seeing in person. I tried my best to capture the Mini LED panel so that you can visually see these differences. One very important thing that I will stress is that none of the displays have had any adjustments, and these are all out-of-the-box experiences in terms of the colors, saturation, and any other levels besides for the brightness. Let's first compare the Mini LED display against both of the PlayStation Vita models, and it is truly amazing to see of what about 10 years of advancements in display technology can mean for a display. I keep saying how impressed I still am by the Vita just in terms of its size, power, but the small quality of life improvements that comes with advancement of technology is quite apparent when these three are all side by side with each other. All three devices here are set to their maximum brightness, and it's no contest. The Mini LED display absolutely destroys the brightness of both the Vita models. Now let me adjust the camera to properly reflect what I actually see on the Odin 2 Mini, as it does appear to wash out the text of the title screen for Hohokam, which by the way is an awesome Vita game to enjoy. The text is actually not washed out in person, and so it's really difficult to convey just how insane the brightness is, but also showcase that the brightness is not washing out this display. This is also a good opportunity to see some of that vignetting in the Mini LED panel, and a good opportunity to explain what that means here. Vignetting occurs because of the lack of brightness uniformity, and on Mini LED panels this makes the edges of the screen seem dimmer than the center. Depending on the panel, this can be quite noticeable, but I do think here on the Minis panel this is actually better than expected, and for me stands out mostly in scenes like the one shown with Hohokam, which is a very bright and white scene. So let's go back to Hohokam for a moment, and now let's gradually adjust the brightness down a little bit and see how low we need to go until we match the brightness of both the Vita 1000 and 2000. So stopping at about what I'd say is around 20% brightness on the Mini, it looks like we've matched the brightness of both the Vitas. So no doubt about it, the brightness is very impressive here. The reality is that the majority of Mini users will not use this display at 100% brightness indoors because it is not needed at all. Personally, I have been using mine at around 20 to 30% or so indoors, which I really like, but I do sometimes bump it up to 50% since my home does get quite bright from the Arizona sun. And speaking of the Arizona sun, this is where that 100% brightness and that top end of 1100 nits comes into play, since outdoors in sunlight, the panel on the Odin 2 Mini is still quite visible, and that's probably the biggest game changer for anyone that enjoys playing outdoors in various scenarios. I took my Switch OLED outdoors as well to show how it fares in the sunlight, and of course when I did this test for both the Mini and Switch, it was a rare partially cloudy day in Arizona. But for one of my doggos, Nala, just another normal day rolling around in the turf enjoying the sunlight. Okay, let's head back indoors and continue to compare screens here. Again, pay attention to the edge of the Mini's display and the comparison of brightness between displays. Let's now bring in some different handhelds to compare against, which are obviously much newer. First, let's compare the Switch Lite against the Mini, and both screens here are set to their maximum brightness of 100%. I want to stress again that 100% brightness in a dark room is completely unnecessary, and this is more of an example to show differences in technology which all have their own strengths and weaknesses. This is a great example to show another common issue with Mini LED, which is blooming, and is especially noticeable at that max 100% brightness indoors. Again, an uncommon scenario for most users. So let me pause right here during the Ori and the Blind Forest intro, and pay attention to the center of the screen where there is light shining through the tree. We can very clearly see that light is spilling into the dark parts of the scene, which causes a sort of halo effect, and it perfectly shows off what blooming is when referring to this phenomena on Mini LED panels. Okay, let's do another pause here, and after I reduce the brightness to about 30%, which is closer to matching the Switch Lite's max brightness, we can see that blooming effect is far less prominent than before. Also, pay attention to the contrast here, as while not immediately noticeable, and partly just my camera's inability to pick it up, you can see how the Switch Lite is in fact washing out those black levels in the top left corner here. Okay, let's now bring in the Switch OLED, which for me visually has one of the nicest looking displays I've seen in the handheld space. Now some of this can be subjective, but in terms of ranking my preferred displays, I will say that OLED still wins out for me despite the lack of brightness. The Mini LED panel on the Odin 2 Mini falls perfectly in the middle between the more common LCD panel on the Switch Lite and the OLED panel here on the Switch OLED. Again, things like contrast and black levels are really good on the Mini LED, even at higher brightness levels, and again, which is something the Switch OLED cannot compete with when it comes to this. Long story short, none of these technologies are perfect. This next footage truly demonstrates this as we bring in the Mini's older sibling, the original Odin 2 and the Anbernic RG556, which has an OLED panel, and a really good one at that. Now, can you guess which one is which? Well, if you guess the RG556 is at the top, the Mini is in the middle, and then the original Odin 2 at the bottom, I'll give you an extra entry for my RG Cube giveaway that should be happening pretty soon on the channel. Just comment down in the description and I'll make note of it. Now, a camera can be quite deceiving as it can hide some of the flaws that I personally can see here in person. Likewise, it can accentuate those flaws on a display as well. This roll of footage demonstrates that perfectly, but does again drive home my point that no display is perfect. And again, for me, the mini LED panel falls perfectly in the middle behind the OLED on the 556, with the original Odin 2 coming in third here. The Odin 2 at the bottom does closely show what I see in terms of blacks and colors washing out, and it's slightly exaggerated by the camera settings, but does show the weakness of that panel. Even RetroTech Mommy chimed in and chose the panels in the same order as me, so at least that reassures me that my eyes aren't completely broken. Look, I can spend an entire video just talking about displays and comparisons, but I really want to stress that the Mini's display overall is quite good, especially when talking about Mini LED, and I think for those that want to game outdoors, this is a game changer. I also think that the majority of the population will not notice or even care about these things, like the vignetting and blooming, since in most conditions it's just not really very noticeable. So I demonstrated a bit of the blooming and vignetting, but Mini LEDs have another weakness that isn't talked about as much, which is the technology's poor pixel response times when you specifically shift from black to white scenes. This is going to go unnoticed by most, and personally I'm only aware of it because of my familiarity with the technology in the Apple space, where Benjamin Mayo has talked extensively about the weaknesses of the Mini LED panels used in Apple hardware. In fact, I'm going to replicate the same example he used on Apple displays here for the Odin 2 Mini. Now, if you notice, when I scroll up and down on Benjamin's website, you can see this trail that's being left behind. If you didn't catch it, let me slow down the footage a bit, and then you will see how the display doesn't shift from black to white fast enough to keep up with my scrolling. Again, this is a very specific example, and in most scenes, or for most users, it will not be apparent at all. One last thing, for those concerned that the display is too bright even at its lowest setting, Android 13 does have the extra dim option built in, and you can add it to the quick access, which does drop the brightness levels even further, and I think that at the lowest setting, especially with the extra dim option, this is not going to bother anyone in a very dark room, for example when you're laying in bed playing. Okay, no more display talk, let's discuss the build quality and comfort briefly. The Mini is a very well built handheld, and the teardown that follows will show some of that, but the handheld feels very solid and rigid in the hands. Nothing rattles here, there's no give when doing a bend test, and the finishing of the materials is quite nice. I've been very surprised by how comfortable I have found the Mini to be in my heavy use over the past week or so. Now, my grip does change depending on the type of game I am playing, so if I am utilizing the left analog stick primarily or using the D-pad predominantly, I will adjust my grip as needed. But neither of these have felt uncomfortable for me, even over a longer session of gaming. The audio is another area that surprised me quite a bit and really stands out, especially at those higher volume levels, which are impressively loud, clear, and punchy. The size of the Odin 2 Mini clearly did not compromise the audio quality here, so let's take a quick listen to this. And of course, the controls are equally solid, with everything working and responding as I would expect, and in particular, I am just loving the D-pad, but this wasn't too surprising given how much I enjoy this D-pad over on the Odin 2 and Retroid devices, but I think this just might be the best one yet from AYN between the texture and overall feel. I'm having no issues moving around and pulling off combos in my usual Marvel vs. Capcom 2 test, using the PlayStation 2 version here in Nether SX2. And we have finally reached my personal favorite part of these videos, and yes, it's time to tear down the Odin 2 Mini and figure out how AYN managed to squeeze all of these components into this tiny shell. AYN is using a screwless design, at least in terms of what's visible, which is pretty nice and does make the unit look very sleek. So I really wanted to be very careful when trying to get this back cover off, since I obviously don't want to damage the shell, since I've grown quite fond of the Odin 2 Mini in just the short amount of time that I've had it. After messing around with various separation tools, I decided to just use my fingers, as the seams between the front and the back portions of the shell are so tight that even some of my thinnest tools couldn't get between it. But luckily I didn't clip my nails completely down, and I was actually able to get just enough separation so that I could then get a proper wedge tool in there to get everything else separated. You can probably hear the retention tabs separating, and I suspect that there's quite a few of them going all around this back plate, since this is pretty secure. Okay, it looks like I'm able to now get this backplate off, and there's nothing secured to this backplate, so you don't need to worry about any cables that might get damaged. Let's take a look at this backplate, and I'm actually surprised by how rigid this actually is. The finishing is also really nice as well. At the top, where we have those exhaust vents, you can probably see on camera the screens that have been applied here to help keep dust out. Interestingly, there isn't a screen for the intake, which is a little bit surprising. So enough of the backplate, let's grab the Odin 2 Mini, and with the backplate off, we can really take a moment to appreciate just how clean this looks, and it's very obvious to me that AYN spent time here making everything not only somehow work in this compact space, but also look really good. Considering that the majority of Mini owners will never see this, it's really something worth commending. Now, there are a few things that are visible even at this point, including the single vibration motor, the 5000 mAh battery, the front firing speakers, as well as the fan, heatsink, and the trigger assembly. Oh, and you've probably noticed the amount of screws that are now visible, sneakily hiding beneath that backplate. The nice thing, at least so far, is that these all appear to be the same size, or at least similar sized screws that are just Phillips based, and so I'm feeling like the 000 bit will be the way to go here, and yeah, that does look pretty good. Now, when I actually was working on the footage here, I did learn a few things that we will discover together. I decided to go with removing the screws out of the speakers first, but I realized they didn't pop out as easily as I was expecting, so instead of accidentally breaking something here, I decided to then instead focus on removing all the 13 screws that are surrounding the device along the edge. Okay, so let's quickly go ahead and do just that. So it looks like this plastic shroud is also held into place with some retention tabs, and you will need a pry tool to help separate it out of the shell. This is a pretty interesting design, as it's giving the Odin 2 Mini some additional reinforcement in the middle, which explains why the device feels so solid and rigid in the hands. Now you'll notice that I'm peeking through to make sure there aren't any cables I might have missed to disconnect, but before you remove this plastic shroud, make sure to disconnect the speaker cables, the fan cable, and the cable for the vibration motor. Once all of those cables have been disconnected, we can now safely remove this plastic piece. This portion of the handheld has a few things that are part of the assembly, including the triggers and the fan. We can now get a closer look at the speakers and try to figure out why I couldn't get it out so easily. So I managed to pop out the speaker off camera, and then taking a look at it, I can now understand why it was so difficult to remove, as there is an adhesive at the bottom holding in place to this plastic piece. The other thing worth mentioning is that these screws don't actually need to be removed to remove this plastic piece, as it is screwed into this piece and not the board or the other part of the shell. This is also a pretty sizable speaker, and given the size of the device and how much space we are working with here, it's pretty impressive. With that now out of the way, we can check out the internals fully exposed, which reveals additional components that were hiding away under that plastic shroud. It looks like we have direct access to the analog sticks here, and so if you wanted to replace the analog sticks, you do not need to take out the daughter board, but all the steps that came prior would be what is required to reach it. The same holds true for the battery, which can now be taken out since we now have access to that connector. We can see the heatsink here as well, and then this chonker of a battery, which again is a 5000 mAh battery and is smaller than the one found in the Odin 2, but that isn't all that surprising again given the space constraints. We now also have access to these top shoulder buttons, and this gives us a very nice and close look at these. Now, as I was using this device, I noticed that there was what appeared to be a crack on the inside of the clear plastic, and so I was excited to do this teardown so I could inspect them a bit closer. Now that I have the shoulder buttons in hand, it does appear to be a finishing issue on the surface of the button in the back and not actually a crack. I think this is what AYN meant when they told me that the shoulder buttons were not final. They probably recognized this issue. I did reach out to AYN for confirmation and could not get a response in time for this video. Let's now take a closer look at the dome switch that is being used for the shoulder button, which is actually a lot quieter than I was expecting, at least when it is fully exposed. Okay, I think it's time to get the analog sticks removed from the shell so that we can then get to the daughter board and take a look at additional things. First things first, I will make sure to disconnect the analog stick cable, and then we have two Phillips screws holding the stick in place, which means we can continue to use the same bit to get these removed. Oh yeah, I always forget this, but the analog stick cap actually pops off on these, and so you can actually pop on different caps like the ones I have for my Odin 2, which are white and kind of look cool on the black Mini. Once the cap is removed, the analog stick will come right out, and then we can get a closer look at the movement of the stick, which really lets you appreciate just how much better they are in terms of design compared to the Switch ones. Let's continue on and try to get this daughter board out so we can then take a look at the face buttons and confirm a few things. There are a few cables that need to be disconnected before we can do so, so make sure to disconnect the cable for the select and start, shoulder button, and the cable that connects to the other daughter board. Next, we need to remove the 5 Phillips screws that are in place here, and again, no need to change the bit out. Let's go ahead and quickly remove the screws so we can get this board out of here. Alright, all done, and now the daughter board will lift up very easily out of the shell. So let's get the rubber membrane out and take a closer look at it, and from the side we can see why there's a really solid travel on the face buttons. Now let's take a closer look at the face buttons themselves and check out how they are keyed here and see if we can make the switch from the Xbox to Nintendo style if that's more your thing. These do look like they are uniquely keyed per button, and so most likely these will not be swappable without modification to the button itself. For example, here I swapped B to the A position, and you can see that it does not fit, and so you will need to clip off part of the button in order for this to work. While we're at this point, we might as well go ahead and take a look at the button and see how these crystal style buttons look. It does look like we have a solid color in the interior of the button, and then that lettering which is raised above it, and finally the clear plastic that surrounds it. Alright, we're all done here. Let's move towards the center, and I'm going to pop out the battery and just take a real quick look at it. This is held into place with very strong adhesive, so you will definitely need some force to get it out. I want to reiterate that the battery is accessible once the plastic shroud is removed, since we then have access to the connector. With the battery out of the shell, you will notice that there is a piece of material underneath the cable to protect it, since it does rest across part of the copper pipe running across the board. Another thing worth mentioning is that the battery is obviously beside the processor, and so it doesn't make any real contact with it, which should help with thermals. Now the last thing I want to do here with this teardown is remove this heatsink and check out a little bit of what's going on underneath it. This is held into place with 4 Phillips screws, and one of the screws are protected by a warranty sticker, which is completely understandable since I would not recommend going this far in the disassembly. With all the 4 screws removed, we can now take a look at the backside of the heatsink here, and we can see part of that copper piping coming through. Now below this heatsink, we have a bit more visibility of that Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 that's powering the Odin 2 Mini. You will notice it is enclosed in its own metal shroud, and what appears to be thermal pads that were most likely placed down first, and then the shroud placed over it. Upon closer inspection, we can see that the shroud specifically marks that this is the Odin 2 Mini Pro with 12GB of RAM. I tried my best to capture that for the camera, so my apologies if it's not as visible. Finally, one last thing, let's pop off one of the metal shrouds just so I can show everyone the way this looks without it on. These are sort of clipped into place, and it's a matter of just finding a good point to gently start popping it out of place slowly. I strongly recommend to not do any of this and to just live vicariously through me. So off camera I did manage to pop it off, and now we can see this metal shroud as well as what I suspected are thermal pads that had been placed down first, and then the shielding which was put on afterwards. So we are all done with this teardown, and I definitely have satisfied my curiosity here, and I really have to say that going through this, it really makes me appreciate the level of engineering that AYN put into the Odin 2 Mini. It's truly impressive to see this much packed into this compact of a space, and so it's now time to see how this Odin 2 Mini can stand up to some gaming. And I'm finally so excited to be able to showcase some emulation on the Odin 2 Mini. And if you're not familiar with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, it's an absolute powerhouse of a chipset that I've been covering for more than a year now, first with the Red Magic 8 Pro, and then with the Odin 2, which still to this day was such a pleasant surprise to see in a handheld, especially at its price point. The Odin 2 Mini continues its older sibling's legacy by providing the same performance with that Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, just in a smaller package. The Odin 2 Mini will have absolutely no issues handling essentially everything that can be emulated on Android, and obviously when it comes to platforms prior to the 6th generation, it hardly breaks a sweat. Now in terms of the 6th generation of consoles, we have both PlayStation 2 and Gamecube that can be emulated on Android, and again the results are just impressive with the Odin 2 Mini. Every game that is being demonstrated here is only using the standard performance mode with the Smart Fan option for the Odin 2 Mini, which really has proven to be more than enough to handle most of the gaming demands that you would expect to see on an Android-based device. For Gamecube, I'm going to just jump right into some F-Zero GX, which is always a great way to benchmark performance, and using Dolphin mainline from the Play Store, we are able to max out Dolphin's resolution scaling, which is 6 times native or the equivalent to 4K. This is obviously absolutely unnecessary since the Mini only has a 1080p panel, but the fact that we can run F-Zero GX without hacks or tweaks at 6x native is just incredible. Likewise, PlayStation 2 performance with Nether SX2 is very impressive as well. And for this, I tested a few of my favorite games, but the Mini really has the power to handle essentially anything that you throw at it, with the only limitation really being the emulator itself. Performance, of course, will vary based on the game you are playing, but for example here I have Burnout Revenge set to use 4 times the native resolution, and the Mini is barely breaking a sweat here, with it just needing standard mode to achieve this. PlayStation 2 looks absolutely stunning on here, and this is just a real treat. Most of my favorite games were running at 4X, and again, it's really only limited by the capabilities of the actual emulator itself. We're definitely not done with the Sony platforms, and let's shift over to the handhelds, first with some PlayStation Portable. And with the Odin 2 Mini, we are essentially at PSP endgame for emulation on Android, as the Odin 2 Mini will basically have no trouble handling even the most demanding games like God of War Chains of Olympus at 10 times native resolution, which again is completely unnecessary, but very impressive when trying to benchmark how far we can push the Mini in terms of PSP emulation. With it being able to handle God of War at that level of performance, we can assume that most of the library will be able to be enjoyed with similar benefits, including a personal favorite of mine with Ridge Racer. But one of the things I was most excited to do with the Odin 2 Mini was to revisit Vita emulation on Android with the Vita 3K emulator. Now, I do have to temper expectations, as Vita 3K is still very much a work in progress that actually just got an update to version 12 while I was working on this video and enjoying my time with the Mini. All I have to say is that I've been having a blast going through Vita games on this device, and the Mini in so many ways feels like the way I did the first time I loaded up Wipeout 2048 on the Vita OLED and experienced graphics of that level in a handheld. While a lot of the games from the Vita library don't work that well, including some favorites, I was pleased to find an equally sizable amount of games that work just fine, including Wipeout 2048, which, by the way, I have running here at 4x native resolution. This is absolutely amazing to me, as we're on a device that not only resembles the Vita, but as we saw is not much larger or heavier than that launch OLED Vita, and so Vita emulation for me has been the absolute highlight and just a real treat overall. I spent the most time enjoying the Mini in the past week just playing through my library of Vita games like Gravity Rush, Geometry Wars, Futuridium, TXK, and Ho-Ho-Come. You will notice that some of the games are ones returning from earlier on in the video, and I chose some of them because I thought they were great demonstrations of the Mini's display as well. If you're interested in a Mini, you have to give Vita emulation a try and check it out on this device. It's a ton of fun. Okay, let's head back to Nintendo land, and a platform that just gets no respect is the Nintendo Wii, and again is a great showcase of the power that we have here with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, as we can play Wii games using upscaling and without much issue, outside of the limitations that come with the emulator and some of the control nuances because of the Wii Remote. There are lots of great Wii games that work very well without the need for the crazy waggle controls, and it's well worth taking the time to explore the library on the Odin 2 Mini. I had a weird hankering to play some Call of Duty Black Ops on here, and it is pretty awesome seeing this game running on the Mini using upscaling with the footage here set to 3x native resolution. So let's end our emulation showcase with one last platform, and I actually just covered this quite extensively in my last video, which was using Sudachi emulator on the Anbernic RG556. Now with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 that's in the Mini, the door to Switch emulation opens up a whole lot more, partly because we have a massive amount of more power available, but also because support in general is much better for Snapdragon chipsets, and so we are able to use custom drivers for Sudachi to help with compatibility. I once again used Sudachi to test a bunch of my favorite Switch games, and results are really good with Switch emulation. Again, much like Vita 3K, Sudachi compatibility is not perfect, and Switch emulation in general on Android has hit a bunch of roadblocks, but Sudachi is the spiritual successor to Yuzu and picks up where it left off with added compatibility for newer games. I do think it's important to stress that while Switch emulation is quite performant here with the Odin 2 Mini, ultimately the best compatibility is on an actual Switch, and so limit your expectations if you are wanting to do Switch emulation with the Mini, as there will be a good portion of the library that just simply won't work here. I have covered Switch emulation quite a bit with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, and I will have those videos linked in the description if you're curious about the progress and the types of games that are playable. Now, another area when it comes to gaming, and something that is so severely overlooked, is native Android gaming. This is another topic I have covered multiple times on the channel, and there are tons of great games that have been ported to Android and are available on the platform natively, directly off the Play Store, and so I definitely recommend checking out those games. There are also a ton of fun mobile games with controller support that are available on the Play Store, and the best thing about having a device with a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 means that we can basically turn up the settings on tons of the games available for the platform, including popular titles like Call of Duty Mobile and Star Wars Hunters, which is a game that I've been hooked on recently and runs so well on the Odin 2 Mini with settings all maxed out here. Finally, before we move on to battery life and thermals, I did want to quickly demonstrate some Genshin Impact and show off the controller mapping that is built into the Odin 2 overlay. This is a pretty simple thing to get going, and if you're familiar with prior devices from AYN, much has remained the same. So just swiping in from the right will bring up the overlay. From there we select key adapter, which then brings up another window. From here you can place down things like analog sticks and buttons as you see fit. For each button you place down, you can then press a corresponding one on the Odin's controller to assign it. Tapping on the analog sticks gives you additional options for how the sticks should behave in terms of simulating input or movement on the touchscreen. Some games will need these settings adjusted, but for Genshin I use the adjust view mode, which feels very natural and almost like the game has native controller support as a result. Once you are done configuring it the way you like, you just have to hit on the check mark, and that's all there is to it. You can see that this is a really awesome way to add support for the Mini's built-in controller to games that don't support it natively. And after all of this intensive gaming, how does the battery and the thermals hold up on the Odin 2 Mini, which has a smaller 5000 mAh battery, and so it's not going to be much of a surprise here that it's not as good as the bigger Odin 2 with its 8000 mAh battery. Let's check out my usual lightest test with Yoshi's Island for the Super Nintendo and at 30% brightness and volume, with no Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, battery saver turned on, and the standard mode with no fan. The Odin 2 Mini managed about 8 hours of battery life. Now let's check out something far more demanding, and it's time to see the return of Kratos and his never-ending leaping using God of War 2 for the PlayStation 2 and Nether SX2 at 50% brightness and volume with the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth turned back on, using standard mode and the sport fan setting. God of War 2 managed a little over 2.5 hours of on-screen time. Now something important to keep in mind is that I have God of War 2 set here to use a 4x upscale, and so it is definitely pushing the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 quite hard with those settings, and turning down the upscaling will result in longer battery life, as well as making other adjustments here like brightness and even using the smart fan option instead of sport. Finally, one more battery test for fun. Since I've been all in on Vita with the Odin 2 Mini, I thought it would be fun to grab my Vita 1000 and 2000 and put it up against the Odin 2 Mini. So I loaded up Gravity Rush for all three devices, and I went with about a 30% brightness and 50% volume with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth still on, using the standard mode and smart fan option. I chose 30% brightness because this is pretty close to the max brightness of both the Vita 1000 and 2000, which yes, are on max brightness in this footage. My poor Vita OLED didn't quite fare so well here, as I'm sure its battery is aging and probably needs to be replaced. But the Odin 2 Mini did come in at just a little over 3 hours and 45 minutes, which I think is pretty solid. I gotta give it to the Vita 2000, which improved battery life over the Vita 1000 back in the day. And in terms of getting back up and running again, I used a 65 watt power adapter and the battery charged to 50% battery life in about 30 minutes. For a full charge, it took about 1 hour and 30 minutes. So I figured while I had God of War 2 running, I might as well grab some thermals since this was pretty demanding and pushing the Mini quite hard, and so after about an hour of gameplay, I recorded the thermals here on the Mini. There's no doubt that the Mini does get warm, and it can be noticeable depending on what you are emulating, and it's tough because the size and the limitations of that are apparent. Now, I still think the thermals here are better than expected, and for the most part while gaming, I only noticed warmth on the upper left side of the handheld, but in the back where my middle finger rests. Which makes sense since that is right by the processor as well as the exhaust of the heatsink. Interestingly, I didn't observe temperatures above 41.6 Celsius anywhere on the handheld, with that temperature actually being the hottest observed specifically at the top of the handheld where the heat exhausts. The controls were substantially cooler, hovering in the low 30s. On the back, at that spot that I mentioned, it does reach 40 degrees Celsius, which explains why it feels warm to my middle finger, and it does look to be the hottest spot on the back of the device, with the majority of it staying in the low to mid 30s range. I do want to point out that I live in Phoenix, Arizona, and so during this time of year, my ambient temperature is higher than normal, and so keep some of that in mind as well. Okay, this video has probably gone on for far too long, and I do really appreciate it if you stuck around to watch my coverage here of the Odin 2 Mini. I really wanted to make sure I covered as many talking points as possible and as thoroughly as possible. When the Odin 2 Mini was first announced, I was not as excited admittedly since it just seemed like an Odin 2, but smaller. Once I received the Mini in my hands, it started to click a bit more, and now after a solid week of enjoying the device, I think it will actually end up replacing my Odin 2 as my Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 device of choice. I really do enjoy the smaller form factor, but this is not going to be for everyone since you are paying a little extra for that size. The original Odin 2 is still the best value when talking about pure performance to cost, and the Odin 2 Mini will have a very specific market with those concerned about weight and size. But that's not to discredit the Odin 2 Mini, as it's a remarkable piece of engineering that does so much right. It also still has that incredible Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, and for many, is still the endgame when it comes to Android emulation and gaming, and a device like the Mini can then be enjoyed for a long time to come. There's no doubt about it, I think we will be seeing more of the Odin 2 Mini here on the channel, but until then, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.